what I want to talk very briefly is about the role of archaeologists, or specifically archaeologists, have in licensed exhumations. And I'm going to finish off with a very quick case studies. And what I'm talking about is the exhumation of bodies, a body or bodies under license. And we'll have a little bit of a look at that. But usually this is in plots in cemeteries. So this is not clandestine graves. So we're not talking about clandestine graves, bodies in under patios, in cellars, in pharmaceuticals and things. We're talking about the use. We're talking about not talking about the use of graves in existing cemeteries, which have been used to insert illegal burials, weapons caches, and things like that. The only reason why I put this in was partly to tie in what Aidan's just been talking. But in Northern Ireland, some of the Republican paramilitary groups did used to use cemeteries because it's somewhere where people have already buried stuff, dug holes. So you can see there's a sensible modus operandi. We're not talking about that. And I'm not talking about kind of mainstream heritage archaeology where we're talking about clearance and excavation of historic cemeteries such as HS2 at Euston. There are guidance frameworks, and the National Crime Agency has produced practice advice on conducting exhumations from lawful burial sites. This is currently under review, and I think a new version is due.
Yeah, almost there.
Almost there. So why would we want to conduct an exhumation? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. HS2, we've got building work and we've got a historical cemetery in place. We can sometimes get remains buried in the wrong place. Sometimes there's family wish of recovery of personal possessions. There may be public health grounds, or it may well be a change in clear direction from the deceased. So it's come to place that somebody's been buried and actually their wishes were to be cremated. But the ones that probably are going to involve forensic archaeologists more than anything else is in order to establish identify of buried persons who weren't identified at the time, particularly to obtain DNA, and also obviously as part of a criminal investigation. And we can all think of, sort of cases where bodies have been buried, exhumed under license in order to do toxicological screening. The legal frameworks is the Section 25 of the 1857 Burials Act, which basically says, most of you who work in planning areas will be familiar with this, that it's unlawful to remove a body without license from the Secretary of State, an MOJ license, or if it's in a consecrated ground, that would also, in certain circumstances, be a Church of England faculty. And obviously, slightly different legislation pertaining in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and so on and so forth. I have actually given a link there. The DCA guide for the burial ground managers, page 42, Annex B, which is a very handy flow chart. So if you Google that, you find it fairly easily. It's a little bit old now, but I think anybody who's interested in the mechanism that's it's is it consecrated ground? Yes, no. Is it under the Church of England? Yes, no. It's kind of that line. So it's quite a useful summary. Within the NCA exhumation resources checklist, what you can see is that specifically forensic anthropologists, forensic archaeologists are listed along with mortuary staff, CSI, and photographers, exhibits officers, pathologists, etc., etc. So, why do we want to use archaeologists? Other than the fact that the guidelines say we should do, why would we want to use archaeologists? Well, the issues as I see it is principally that you've got the potential of multiple burials in individual plots. So you've got a defined plot within a cemetery, but you may have stacked burials. So you may have more than one individual in that particular plot. The second point of which, and I'll speak about them more, is modern coffins collapse particularly easily. I'm getting nods from colleagues who've had experience of this. And unlike for those of you that might have been experiencing dealing with 18th, 19th century burials in nice, elmwood coffins that are quite, well put together, even though they've been buried a longer time frame, trust me, they will be in generally a better form of containment than you've got with a modern coffin, even if it's only been in the ground a relatively short time. And obviously, this goes back to what Alistair was talking about, we need to be able to actually show that we can actually, we've targeted the remains and we've identified the remains that we are looking for. It's not that we've got a degree of accountability. And within the prospect of coffin collapse and all the rest of it, we need to have a mechanism in place where we can potentially sort out commingled remains. What I would say is that doesn't mean to say that you, as an archaeologist, are the only person there who's got things to contribute. And I would also say that the grave diggers, particularly if they're grave diggers who operate in that cemetery, have a wealth of experience, both of the burial conditions and all the rest of it. They can also be very useful in conjunction with cemetery managers in frankly making sure you've got the right plot, which, I know that sounds a bit basic, but it does happen in the criminal justice system. It wouldn't be the first time that the wrong door has been put through in an active police investigation. So we don't want to be in the same place of digging up the wrong grave. And they're very useful in assisting the overburden. So the bottom line in modern coffins is they're effectively nasty chipboard with a veneer finish over the top, even if you spend quite a lot of money on them. The other thing which we also get is very often, if you go into most, catalogues, basically they're designed so they also fit the regulations of promotion as well. But they do warp, collapse, and certainly the lids with a soil overburden on them when they've got soggy don't tend to remain intact. The other thing which I want to talk very briefly about is depth of burials. And again, I've put a little bit of detail in there. Where you're dealing with stacked burials, the regulations generally are about the actual minimum depth of the uppermost burial, and that's usually can be as little as 2 foot if everybody's fulfilling the regulations. There is a little bit of variation that depends on soil type and all the rest of it. So you might have a grave which is 6 foot deep, but your stacked most recent burial that might not necessarily be 6 foot, is what I'm basically saying. Just a very quick one on health and safety. Obviously, there is a massive difference in terms of health and safety of dealing with a relatively recently fleshed body that you're exhuming as opposed to skeletal remains. And I'm dealing with things like bacterial loads. I'm dealing with, other aspects that may be related for dealing with fresh remains, and actually a physical lifting issue out of a confined grave spot. And one of the problems that we've got is, if you've got a coffin which is no longer intact, you can't simply put some strops in it and kind of lift it out. So you can't kind of reverse the process that the grave diggers did to put it in the first place. What I would say is that excavation down into the grave cut does lead to some degree of acrobatics, which is why I don't do it myself anymore. Usually we're not in a position to widen out grave plots. We're obviously in a cemetery confined with other plots adjacent, for which we will not have an MOJ license to go into that area. So we're effectively digging down the original cut, and that usually means balancing off scaffolding planks head down, and what you're excavating is a semi-collapsed coffin or coffins at the bottom of it. When do exhumations take place? Usually in the evening or early morning. There's actually no legislation about this. I did actually get this checked up after I got back from doing an exhumation which started at midnight. And I went, is there any legal basis why we had to start at midnight? And the answer is actually it may stipulate on the MOJ license, but there's nothing in law that I understand which says that it has to be done that. What it does state is that a night exhumation gives you the maximum amount of time for the disturbance of the remains, for having the cemetery closed off, or that part of the cemetery closed off, and to be able to do whatever you need to do with the post-mortem and the reinterment. So that's the reason, and it's about public perception, public intrusion. In general, anecdotally, and this is taken from the NCA document, the entire process takes about 16 hours, but that obviously depends on how long the post-mortem activity takes. If it's just simply a question of recovering some remains, taking some samples, and then immediately returning it, obviously that's quite a quick turnaround. If the post-mortem process is a bit more detailed, then obviously that's going to take longer. So I just want to very briefly finish off with this one. It's an exhumation from 2012. Basically, a skeletalized body was found in 1981. Obviously, things like DNA technology was not terribly well developed in 1981, and certainly not developed to what we can do now. It was at the time felt that she probably died 2 years before her body was found, based on state of decomposition. There was also stratigraphy, a yogurt pot with a batch date on it underneath the body. So, yeah, and also the analysis of the plant growth by the forensic botanist suggested at least one full growing season. Then there was an initial 18 months investigation, but it wasn't able to produce any positive identifications. There was a facial reconstruction of the skull. Again, old school wax modeling, not the kind of facial reconstructions we're used to now. The remains were buried in a unmarked grave with simply a number, and the case was left open. In 2012, there was a cold case review. It was realized that there was a number of areas of investigation of possible identifications, and DNA technology had moved on. So there was a license to exhume the remains. 2 forensic archaeologists were called in, which was myself and Andy Holland. The site was cordoned off to prevent viewing during the active exhumation. The adjacent gravestones were wrapped in plastic wrap to protect them. There was a scene tent over the target, and there was a clean and dirty decontamination area. Honestly, back in 1981, she was skeletalized. I don't think we really needed to have a clean and dirty area, but the regulations say that that's how you have to set it up. So we did it. I'm not going to spend long on it because I'm running out of time, but press management was, I think, excellent on this. They effectively showed the press at a time which worked for their deadlines what was going to happen and explained why they couldn't be there at the time of the exhumation. Everybody met their print and broadcast deadlines. The press went away happy. And actually, because the police investigation wanted people to come forward with potential identification, it was actually quite important that the press were engaged with that. Yeah, standard health and safety, avoidance and contamination stuff. Slightly less stringent back in 2012 than it would be currently because there's different DNA technologies and things. Excavation commenced at midnight, fairly straightforward. Chipboard coffin had collapsed, but still contained the remains. Actually, it was actually a no-brainer. The skeletalized remains were still sealed in a plastic bag with the seal from the mortuary from when they did the post-mortem. So yeah, it was a question of me reaching down, picking up a bag and handing it to the exhibits officer. So that was fairly straightforward. We took DNA samples and the remains were reinterred. And unfortunately, we didn't get a identification on any of those lanes. So it's still, as far as I'm aware, is an open